Welcome to The Beauty of Conflict, a podcast about how to deal with conflict at work, at home, and everywhere else in your life. I'm CrisMarie.
And I'm Susan. We run a company called Thrive, and we specialize in conflict resolution, communication, and building strong, thriving teams and relationships. Conflict shows up in our lives in so many ways. Most people, unfortunately, are not very good at handling conflict. Most people have never been taught the right tools for dealing with conflict. And then it leads to unnecessary friction, arguments, passive-aggressive emails, tears, hurtful comments, stuckness, all kinds of things we don't want. We're on a mission to change all of that.
We spent the last 20 years teaching our clients how to handle conflict in a whole new way. We're here to show you that conflict doesn't have to be scary and overwhelming. With the right tools, you can turn a moment of conflict into a moment of reinvention. Conflict can pave the way into a beautiful new system at work, a new way of leading your team, a new way of parenting, a new chapter of your marriage where you feel more connected than ever before. Conflict can lead to beautiful things. So today we're going to talk about inclusion and diversity, which is a pretty hot topic these days in corporate America. Would you agree, Susan?
Yes, I think, there's just it brings up a lot of potential conflict. It brings up a lot of different issues on all different sides of how this goes. And even in trying to define it and give it a clear and distinct definition, that's not easy to do.
Yes. And the one thing, there's been a lot of research. McKinsey and Company several years ago did research that showed that diversity at the executive level makes for better bottom line results, whether that's gender, racial, all sorts of different diversity. It actually leads to financial benefit, which is why I think it's got the attention of corporate America, because it does have bottom line results. And it's this sense of one definition of inclusion, like diversity is a way of getting to inclusion, which is creating an experience for others that makes them feel valued, respected, and that they feel like they belong or they're worthy and they matter. That's really the inclusion definition. And often diversity is in service of getting people to inclusion. I know you want to say something.
I do appreciate both the mention of the broader definition and the research. And for me, one definition of this that I have heard more recently that I thought was really quite rich and says a lot is the idea that, diversity is the invitation to the party. And inclusion is when you get asked to dance. And I think and they are different. They're not the same thing. Right. I think in corporate America today, we're trying to say diversity, let's get the numbers. Let's invite people to the table. Let's make sure we have women, we have different races, we have different nationalities. So maybe then it can become a stat, a number,
yeah.
Something like, oh, we made our quota type of thing. And however, diversity without inclusion, if you're actually just going to invite people to the party, but they actually don't get to dance or they're not really able to dance because, no one really recognizes that they're not getting to dance, then you have a pretty serious problem. And diversity without inclusion is not very helpful.
Right. And, we all have, one of the things is we all have prejudice. And you've seen our check it out model or check out your story. We talk about the personal filter, and this we talk about in both our Beauty of Conflict books, one for couples and business. But in check out your story, what happens is incoming information comes in and it processes through a personal filter. We all have these personal filters. They're made up of our significant emotional events, which include our gender, where we lived, our family of origin, all the experiences that have had loud impacts on us. And in this filter, what happens is we delete, distort, and generalize information. So I think you had a real good example of a blue-eyed person based on your history. What happened for you?
Well, in my history, there was a very charismatic person in my life who happened to have blue eyes. And in spite of kind of the charisma of the guy and the way he could tell a good story, he was also someone who did some pretty horrific things. And as a result of those things, I actually have had a real aversion to people with blue eyes. And
So
I
this is
didn't even
CrisMarie.
know.
This is CrisMarie, and I have blue eyes, so she's certainly gotten over it. But at the time, a long time ago, you didn't even realize you had it.
I didn't know that was even going on.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that's just a simple example of where if I hadn't have learned that, it could play havoc, because I would literally disregard people who had blue eyes.
And so people, like for me, I grew up with an alpha male, my dad. And so it's very clear I deal with alpha men differently. I don't even know that I'm doing it. It's automatic. So there's these things where we've had, whether they're traumatic or loud or impactful experiences way when we were young, that influence how we show up. So it creates what's called in the nomenclature as unconscious bias. It's things that we don't even recognize. We're deleting somebody. We may interrupt somebody. We may assume they're not as important as we are. There's all sorts of things we do. They're called microaggressions, where we behave in ways that we're not aware of how excluding we're being.
And the difficulty about even talking about this is that, one, the other word that comes up in any of this discussion is the word privilege. And what happens is some people have, because of culture, because of the way our society has been set up, have lived with more privilege than others. And that word alone can cause all sorts of ramifications when it gets brought up. And really, privilege has a lot to do with that unconscious bias, that personal filter that you carry. And it's very tricky to have these conversations. And what we try to do is, in our cultures, we've tried in organizations and businesses and all sorts of ways to make rules, laws, and politically correct ways of communicating to protect people who, quite frankly, have been mistreated, oppressed, discriminated against, all sorts of things. And yet, in our attempt to make it safe and make it politically correct, we haven't really served the purpose of having the right conversation and getting into what is a particularly conflictual issue. And it becomes very rigid and tight, and people don't communicate with each other. I learned to say the right thing or what I'm supposed to say, and then the conversation doesn't happen.
I think that's so true, Susan, because, and if you've been listening to us, that we believe conflict is when people can show up as their whole selves, say what's really true for them, whatever we're talking about, and then have that discussion and hang in for each other. And if I'm trying to, well, wait a minute, I might not say the right, I want to say something, but then I'm filtering, I'm going to say it the wrong way. Well, what's happened to my idea? That's gone out the window because I'm so worried I'm going to offend somebody. So we're not saying don't be sensitive. That's not the message, but be aware of how rigid, if I've got to follow all these rules, that we don't think that's the solution either. We do have a middle way that we think is valuable, which is learning how to check out your stories and interrupt what's happening and find out, was it your intention? What's going on. And I think you have a story around this, Susan, when you were working.
Well, CrisMarie, I was thinking about, when I was working up in Canada for a number of years, I worked in the Aboriginal Native American communities. And at that particular time, I was often the white woman in the room. And when I first went into one particular area where I was working, I was trying really hard to say the right thing, do the right thing. And there was a woman who was the shaman of that particular community. She was the elder. She was the wise woman who had a politically high status in her community as well. And she actually dragged me into the bathroom one day and said, in her very, kind and considerate way, although very directly, she said, I'm going to tell you this really bluntly. Don't try to be one of us. And don't try to
what was she
do
meaning?
This right. She said, you keep trying to, I think you've heard someone told you, we don't like eye contact, or we need to go at our own time frame. And I don't know all the rules you've made up about Native people, or someone has told you not to cross the line, but I'm going to sit here and tell you right now, stop that. You show up as you and be curious about the impact you have.
Oh.
And this goes to, another one of my favorite quotes is, it's not what you do, it's what you do next. And she was basically telling me, you're going to make mistakes because you are not one of us. However, that's not the problem. The problem is you're trying to do it right, and you are lousy at it. So quit trying to do it right and notice when you make a mistake and pay attention. And you can be who you are, because that's okay. Don't try to be us. That really is offensive to me.
So being aware, sensitive to the impact. So if you see somebody react a certain way, slow down and check that out. Like something just happened. Is something I did. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, just to bring that home a little further, it wasn't too long down the road in the same situation where I was leading a large group of people. Now, this had both Native American people in it, as well as community leaders from other parts of Canada.
Caucasian?
Yes. And a number of different things. And we were doing a lot of different types of work with people, some on an individual basis. I would work with somebody around some particular issues coming up for them. And there was one woman in the room who was a very high profile leader of the Native American community. And she had come to this program, and she wanted to do some personal work around a very hot topic in Canada, which had to do with residential schools, which has to do with a whole issue of kind of the Aboriginal culture being taken out of their communities, and it's
and a lot of abuse has happened.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I wanted to be able to support her in that. And it was interesting because she had brought along with her to this particular session a couple of people from her community who were, I would call them, this is my word, but like her watchdogs, they were taking care of her. And before, I thought we were going to do some work with her that afternoon, and her two people came up to me and were like, we need to talk. And they proceeded to tell me all the things I could say and couldn't say, and whatever you don't use this word, and don't do this and don't do that. And by the time I had this conversation, I was so rattled. I went into the session, and she came forward asking for some time. And I just kind of looked across at her like, I can't do it. Yeah. I can't work with you. And I said, I feel horrible, and I could tell that was one of those times I thought back like, ooh, look at what I just said. She looks very offended. I said, it may not be what you think it is. And then I told her, I said, I feel very vulnerable because I'm going to make a mistake. I am going to put my foot in my mouth. I just got a whole lessons learned about what to say and not say. And now I'm so afraid of saying the wrong thing that I don't know even how to talk to you. And we went out and we sat in the center of this circle and we had this conversation. It was very touching. And, and a couple times she told me why it was such a big deal when she heard a couple of these words. And she actually got really mad at me about, why the hell haven't I learned this by now? Like, haven't I done? I mean, we had some really, not like soft, nice, polite conversations, but it was a real conversation. And that so moved me. And for her, I was ready. I was like, I'm ready to do the work with you now, and whatever you want to do. She said, I think we just did it.
Wow.
And it was very powerful. And, even for the two people who were so concerned, they said, we had no idea the impact we were having on you by trying to support you and having this go well.
Yeah.
And so often in our desire to make it safe, to make it comfortable, to make it okay, we actually whittle away and don't have the conversation we need, and people don't.
Well, we miss the human connection.
The vulnerability in it. And
because I'm touched just hearing that story, Susan, like that you were actually able to reach each other and drop away and actually even know why those words were triggers for her and being but it's not about following the rules, but having the dialogue and making the connection.
Yeah. I do think, I wasn't going to spend a lot of time on this, but I do think it comes down to it's not what you say, it's what you do next. It's not what you do, it's what you do next, because that is, we cannot always protect each other from the words that we say. We will make mistakes. Yeah. We will do things that are offensive to people and step on toes. And hopefully, instead of being told we can't ever do that, it's wrong, it's inappropriate, someone will have a conversation with us to help us understand how we made mistakes. That's the only way we're ever going to get through this. But that is incredibly awkward and uncomfortable.
Well, and I think that's the key is that when we teach a model, check out your story. And it is about interrupting and saying, hey, I want to check something out. Was it your intention when you said this to insult me? I want to find out because it's insulting over here, but that may not have been what you intended. That scenario. And a lot of times people don't want to. You have to build a culture where you can start doing that, because otherwise you're going to have the meeting after the meeting and say, when you said this, I think it offended Mary and you better go clean it up. Versus if you can start to build a culture where in the meeting, Mary could speak up or I could speak up as a peer of Mary's if I recognized something was going on and say, hey, Ted, you just said this. My story is you were inadvertently insulting Mary. I want to check it out. Mary, did that happen for you? And Ted, was that your intention? I mean, there's a lot of ways that you can do this, but it takes time to build the culture of creating real conversations rather than rule following. And I know when you start, you might have to have rules to make it safe until you build this, because when somebody is probably confronted, if somebody has a lot of privilege, typically the white male has the most, and they're confronted, they feel quite uncomfortable and awkward. And so we want to say it's going to feel that way when people are checking out their stories or asking, is that your intention? Because they're hitting your blind spot. They're pulling something out of your unconscious bias that you thought was nothing. And they're saying, hey, it matters to me over here. That doesn't mean it's wrong or right. It just over here, it lands a different way than what you intended. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's interesting. I can think of recently, we were in another situation with a team and, this was something that threw me off completely. I had no idea. This was various people of nationalities were in the room. And one woman referenced something. She said something about, this is one of those, I hear the angels sing moments. Now I knew exactly what she was talking about.
That's what it means.
Even though I'm not particularly of any religious background, I've lived in America enough and I've lived in the States and I had all sorts of assumptions. You see, the biases are coming out even as I'm talking about it. And there was one gentleman there and I could tell he was like, what did you just say? And at first I thought he was really upset and I thought it was, I didn't even know. He seemed upset. But and then he finally, it's like, I didn't understand. What does that mean? Like this was, I think she had actually said it a couple other times, like maybe at least one more time. And then I got, of course, he had no reference for what I hear the angels singing.
Yeah, that it's not part of his religious context
at all, or anything. I have no, he said, I actually had no clue of what that combination of words meant. And it was just one of those things that it can be sometimes super sensitive, like the things in our culture right now around race and around some gender issues and around, that are highly sensitive. Sometimes it is so unconscious, we have no idea that we're doing it.
And I think the key is, I love that example that you just gave of when he said, I don't understand what you mean by when the angels sing, because he wasn't taking an offense. So it was easier for him to ask. I think when somebody says something and I'm like, oh my God, I take offense, it's really big on my screen. So it's harder for me to come forward and check it out and say, and the more that I've done that, the more power I gain. When I don't do that, I shrink in my power and feel, and I was thinking about this idea of inclusion. I grew up around the dinner table of my Army Colonel dad. And every time he asked, how was your day? He was looking for an executive report on my day. And so I quickly learned not to bring me forward, but to frame whatever I had to say in a way that he could hear it. And I felt so like it wasn't okay to be me at that dinner table. This is my context. And so, and I started to become a people pleaser on, okay, what do I need? Who do I need to be for you to be okay? Who do I need to be in this executive team? Who do I need to be? And I was many different people because I felt so excluded that I was just sure people were not going to accept me for me. And even, I would even say, even when we started working for corporate America, I wasn't going to share that we were in relationships. So you had one dog and I had another in order to pass. And we had the luxury of passing. Some people cannot. But those are all things where we hide parts of ourselves hoping to be included. And I have to say this Brené Brown quote, we just watched The Call to Courage, which we've mentioned in a couple of episodes because it was so powerful, her Netflix special. But she said the opposite of belonging isn't ostracization, being ostracized. It's actually fitting in. And I think so many of us at our jobs, with our friends, wherever it is, we try to fit in, hoping we'll be included. And that's not really what's going on, because who are they including? Not our whole selves. We're framing who we are. And I'm not saying you have to be your whole self. Well, I do think the more you can bring more of you to all these different situations, the more your energy you're going to have, and the more positive impact you're going to have on problem solving and different discussions.
And CrisMarie, it is so clear that some people, like you did mention something in passing that I just want to come back to, because you said it like, we can hide.
Yeah.
And it's true. We, as two white women who, can dress however we look, we're not people who could necessarily, I actually never thought of myself as a person of privilege, but now that I'm a gray-haired white woman living in Montana, I fit the category.
Yes.
And so, and I realized that with that comes responsibility, because that I have to recognize and know that some people who really can't hide,
No.
It is going to be a much more painful process. And sometimes when those people, when they're coming to the table to be included, you may be dealing with their rage.
Yes. Yes.
And I another little just quick story about me was one of the, and I know this probably not, well, one of the worst periods in my life, and really it was 2 weeks that was the worst of it, was when I was in high school, and I was the only white person in my Black high school. And for me, that was not a horrible thing. I found my way through sports and various other things to be who I was. It was actually a way I could show up more fully, because anything weird or awkward about me, I just said all white people are like that. And it really worked well to keep a lot of odd things about me hidden. But one of the things that was one of the most challenging times in my life was when the show Roots came on. This was on, I'm showing my age. And first off, I hated myself. I was gone.
All white people.
All white. I was like, there's no way I couldn't be racist. I must somewhere back there.
And we all are.
We all are. And then the worst part was I would come to school the next day and I'd be slammed against lockers, beaten up, thrown into a locker one time. It was a bad 2 weeks. And it was overtly directed at me. Like, I knew that the people around me were hating me right then. And the sad part was I was hating me too. There was nothing. And, the thing though that I walked away from that with was that, wow, I can't hate myself. So I got to find a way to get through this and own my whiteness, even though I may not always like it. And the second thing I realized was that anger and rage, I understood it. Mm-hmm. And if there was a way for me to give an open space for someone to express that, I wanted to. But I also, realized that the only way that could ever happen is if I was willing to embrace who I was, own my own biases, my own prejudices, and know that they were going to keep coming up. They weren't just going to go away. I wasn't going to suddenly be okay.
And all the people of color in your school, they had to live all their lives like you lived your 2 weeks.
I was like, wow, I've got a 2 week.
Yeah.
And so I really do get, and I want to make it clear, for whether it's around race, whether it's around a religious situation, whether it's around sexuality, some of these issues where people have had long and enduring situations where they have not been heard, seen, maybe been killed even, or harmed. They're going to come to the table with some rage. It's not going to look pretty. And they have every reason to come to the table with that rage.
I sometimes, when I coach women, some women I coach say, oh, I'm not angry. And I'm like, oh my gosh, how can you live in this patriarchal culture and not be angry? We are all angry. Right. And then you add layers of other gender or ethnicity immigrants on top of that. And it is hard not to be angry. And so for people that have dealt with that oppression and rejection and rage at them for just who they are, it makes perfect sense that they has a lot of energy.
Not that I think this, and we have to realize that when someone who has had the privilege has it taken away, that is also painful. And they are angry, hurt, upset, and have no idea how to deal with that either. So I think of right now, we're dealing with a big thing in our culture around the Me Too movement and various things that have come out about male white privilege and wherever that comes from. And even though, every once in a while, I kind of want to do the thing the shaman did. I want to take some of these white men into a bathroom and say, get your act together. But I also get some in some situations, they are angry because they've never dealt with this. They are in a different situation. So,
they were not taught well growing up, and they have, it's hard not to get in touch with the rage, having been abused, but also recognize that these current men may or may not be my abuser. And how can I help educate them and hold for their righteous indignation when they have to get called,
it's a tricky situation.
Yeah. But and all of us are doing things that will inadvertently exclude people. And it's learning and having the conversation, not making right or wrong, but being more sensitive and being able to hear, I get what I just said didn't work. And
what can I do now?
Yeah.
How can, because there's a big political structure to all this, and deep down underneath it, it's also very personal.
It is very personal.
And sometimes the only path we have is to sit across from somebody eyeball to eyeball, because no matter what gender, race, or whatever, we both have some heartbeats in there that is our common ground. And if we can somehow get there and be willing to witness and appreciate somebody else's pain, rage, and somehow cross that bridge, we have a chance. That would be diversity and inclusion. And anything less than that,
it is, and I also recognize we just saw The Most Difficult Year. It's a movie about transgender issues in the state of Washington in Seattle. And people do have to fight the political fight to get to, just like same-sex marriage, all these, the equal rights movement in the 60s, like there has to be that political, warriors that create that space. But I think his name is Aiden, the gentleman who educates on transgender issues in Seattle or Snohomish. He was saying, because there was a lot of hot tempers in this documentary in one part of it. And he said, I can hate those people, but that will darken my soul. And deep down, I know those are good people. They haven't had to deal with this issue. It hasn't touched their lives yet until now in a more personal way. He says, but I hold that they are good people. And as a way, so we can go to hate and rage and make people wrong. And we can also keep coming back to what you said in the beginning. Can I love myself and make room and be curious and interested in another?
It's interesting. You just brought up something that I think it's worth mentioning. We can go to hate and rage. And the thing about hate and rage is there's a tremendous amount of energy in both of them. What is even more frightening is that for a long time, and this is why I think this is so hard for, the male privilege, white male privilege, is that was a culture, and I'm in the white privileged people, that could go to indifference. Almost like these people didn't even exist.
Yes.
And so that indifference is actually way worse than, it may not seem like it when hate and rage is out on the table, but indifference it's kind of like Brené Brown thing, comment about fitting in. Once you can get to fitting in, you can become indifferent. You can become indifferent to people.
Or you can become invisible if you fit in. Just like, and so people can become indifferent to you because you're not, wow, that's interesting.
And so I don't like the level of hate and rage that is surfacing, especially when it comes to kind of nationalism, things like that are coming up. But there's another part of me that's like, that's been under the table a hell of a long time. It was indifference before. It is no longer indifference.
Yeah.
And yes, this is I feel a little vulnerable even saying this, because I'm not saying that's good. I'm just saying there's energy in it now. And now's the time for the conversation. And this is not going to be a conversation that's going to be clean and easy and polite. It's going to get messy. And can we hold for each other?
And that's the work we do in companies, is help people learn the skills, so they can wake up and recognize, wow, I had no idea that was so exclusive, and also build a culture where people can check out their stories and have people become aware, have me become aware, each other become aware of where we are bumping into another person and may not be aware of it. So, and this comes up in couples as well, because it can be we have so many blinders on. And so to let somebody know.
It is actually one of the things that's sort of interesting for us working with couples, because I would say 95% of the couples we work with are actually heterosexual couples.
Yeah.
And when we show up in the room to lead programs and, maybe there's 12 other couples in the room and they're all male, female, and there's us, there's that moment where it's like, what? How can you guys help us?
How can two women help us in a couple?
And then there's the moment at the end of this session where it's like, wow, I could not use she's a woman, I'm a man as an excuse anymore, because you two
I relate to you on this. I relate to her on that. But so people really, it drops down to the human level versus even the male female piece, or you're different than me, because underneath we're all human. And when we connected that deeper level, that's what breaks down those barriers.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, well, this has been rich.
I know. And I mean, it's a tender topic for us to actually do a podcast on. And we think it's an important topic. And just recognize we are all excluding at times because of our unconscious bias, and that we have tools that help each of us become more aware of our unconscious bias and build bridges as opposed to walls.
I do believe that diversity and inclusion will not ever happen unless we do better with conflict.
That is true.
So I hope we can find the beauty in conflict, because I think that's the only way we're really going to get to a point of being diverse and inclusive.
Yeah. With that, we'll take care.
Well, thank you for listening to the Beauty of Conflict podcast. If you're dealing with a difficult situation in your life or work, remember, every conflict is a chance for you to be vulnerable and curious, and find creative solutions that you hadn't considered before, and make your situation even better. Beautiful breakthroughs can be born out of conflict. We've seen this happen thousands of times over the last 20 years, and we know this is possible for everyone, including you. We're grateful you listened to this show, and we're rooting for you.
And if you enjoyed this show, please tell a few friends and/or post a 5-star review on iTunes. Your review helps new listeners discover this show. More people listening to this show means less friction and arguing and suffering out in the world. So that's a great thing for everyone. Also, visit our website, thriveinc.com. That's THRIVEINC.com. to read our articles, join our newsletter, buy our books, and learn more about the services that we offer. Thanks again for listening. We hope you have a peaceful, productive, and beautiful day.